Good morning. Today, with ringing our peace bowl, we affirm our collective hope for peace. We acknowledge that these lands that we love are the ancestral lands of the Yavapai people, the Wipukepas, the Tolkepayas, the Quevkepayas, and the Yavapai. Good morning again, and welcome to Granite Peak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. I'm Suki Jones, your worship associate this morning. We extend a warm welcome to all of you. We're glad you're able to join us, whether here in person or there on Zoom. May you be in good spirits and in good health this morning. One of the things I love about being a worship associate is getting to do some research on the various components of the service. The spiritual we just heard Lena play so beautifully came from the pre-Civil War South. One often cited report says that Abraham Lincoln heard a group of escaped enslaved people singing the spiritual among others during one of his visits to the contraband camp in Washington, D.C. I had never heard of a contraband camp, but that's where escaped slaves often lived. The description notes that Lincoln sang along with the group as they were singing for him. The event was documented with this photograph by famous Civil War photojournalist Matthew Brady, whose photo shows the camp members lined up to receive Lincoln. In our message today, Dr. Mary Ann Clark will be exploring the ways African Americans may have influenced Christian ideas during and after the Civil War. Now, we know and love Mary Ann as an integral part of our congregation. She served as president of the board of directors and on many other committees, currently as the adult faith coordinator, but you may not be aware that Mary Ann has a PhD in religious studies from Rice University, and she's taught both in Houston and at our own Yavapai College. So I give a special welcome to Dr. Clark and thank her this morning, as well as thanking our pianist Lena Hubin and all our Sunday morning volunteers. At this time, please take a moment to make sure your phones are in worship mode. This is the mission statement of our congregation. We are a compassionate, spiritual community that celebrates diversity, nurtures the personal and spiritual growth of all ages, shares our gifts, promotes justice for all, and serves the world we live in. If you're here in person, please join us after the service for socializing in small groups. And if you're viewing the service on Zoom, please join the breakout rooms. This gives us all a time to chat with each other in small groups. If you're with us for the first time, please check out our website for more information about us. That's prescottuu.org. And if you're here in person, stop by our visitors table and chat with a member or two. Before we begin our service, we have a few announcements. We are a busy congregation, so be sure to read the announcements found in the order of service, the weekly peek on our website, and Reverend Patty's videos for updates and announcements. Today's order of service has reminders about the Green Sanctuary starting up again, the food pantry, movies with meaning, and the MLK March. Our regular Zoom meetings are mornings for the Wednesday forum, Wednesday afternoon faith development classes, and Friday lunch with the minister. Bev and Robert, our children's faith development program leaders, have resumed in-person classes for pre-K in the nursery, and the older children meet in the religious education building across the street. We begin our service in the Unitarian Universalist tradition of lighting the chalice. Our chalice lighter this morning is Russ Erickson. With the kindling of this flame, we reaffirm our commitment to accept life's gifts with grace and gratitude, and to use them to bless the world in the spirit of love. Now, I've invited Russ to come up here this morning to sing our first words of gathering.
Okay. Gather the spirit shelter in place. Let's do what we can to flatten the curve. Wash your hands often, don't touch your face. The virus is something no one deserves. Gather on Skype, gather on Zoom, gather by phone with family and friends. Gather online, but don't leave your room. Let's all stay safe until this crisis ends.
So the wonderful news is that these lyrics were written back in 2000. And finally, we can leave our room. Look at you all here today. It's wonderful. We're able to gather in person safely, but with joy in seeing each other. So at this time, please stand and embody your spirit and hum through your masks or dance along with masks to sing the original words of this favorite hymn, Gather the Spirit. Join me in repeating the words of our covenant. Love is the doctrine of this congregation, the quest for truth its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve others in community, thus do we covenant together. Bev Bostrom now joins us via video for our stewardship moment.
Good morning, Granite Peakers. I'm Bev Bostrom. I'm the coordinator of faith development at Granite Peak, and I've been involved there for many, many years. I was actually trying to count last night and I lost track. I really haven't ever been involved with any other Unitarian church. Started out as a Methodist, of course, don't we all? As faith development coordinator, I basically work with the children and youth and have a wonderful time with the kids and their families and presenting ideas to keep them involved in being great Unitarians. When I think about stewardship, I think about other things than money. I think about planning, commitment, love, pledging. Yes, pledging. The people in our congregation are so involved in so many things that involve much, much more than money, but caring, loving, taking care of each other. The folks involved in our beloved community that actually take care of our pledges and our money are so great at deciding which areas need what and cover all the bases. So it's really important for us to back that program, to keep it going, to keep our church alive and well, and serving all of us that are involved. So when it's your turn to show caring and sharing, please do so, because Granite Peak needs you.
Thank you, Bev. Our traditions of joys and sorrows may be different now, but we still continue to struggle with sorrows, and we still find joys to celebrate. For those who wish to share their joy or sorrow, we invite you right now to come up to the microphone and share at this time. So let us be silent for a moment as we hold in our hearts members of our congregation, our community, our nation, and the world. For all the concerns and joys not spoken aloud today, may our spirit embrace you and our love fill your heart. So may it be. Please sing these words of comfort if you are on Zoom, or hum along if you are here in person. As we prepare to take the offering this morning, let us embrace the feeling of connection and community that we have when we gather here each week. Let us remember that this congregation and this generation maybe, and its programs are supported by your generosity. We also give back to the greater community through our Seeds of Support program. This month's recipient is Prescott Area Shelter Services. Please read about them in your order of service. To give online, go to prescottuu.org. On the bottom left-hand side, click the word donate to contribute. The link is also available in the chat on this video. Our ushers will now gather the offering here in this room. We acknowledge the generosity of spirit expressed through this offering. What is given in love is received in gratitude. Blessed be. Dr. Clark has our first reading today.
This first reading is from a sermon by Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards died in 1758, so he's an old guy. He was an American revivalist preacher, philosopher, and congregational theologian. He's widely regarded as one of America's most important and original philosophical theologians. His theological work is broad in scope, but rooted in his Puritan heritage, which you'll hear. This is called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one might hold a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him. You have offended him infinitely more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince. And yet it is nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. It is to be ascribed to nothing else that you do not go to hell, that you did not go to hell last night, that you were suffered to awake again in this world after you closed your eyes to sleep. And there is no other reason to be given why you have not dropped into hell since you arose this morning, but that God's hand has held you up. There is no reason to be given why you have not gone to hell since you have sat here in the house of God, provoking his pure eyes by your sinful, wicked manner of attending his solemn worship. Yea, there is nothing else that is to be given as a reason why you do not this very moment drop down to hell. O sinner, consider the fearful dread you are in. It is a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit, full of the fire and of wrath, that you are held over in the hand of God, whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it, and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder. And you have no interest in any mediator, and nothing to lay hold of to save yourself, nothing to keep off the flames of wrath, nothing of your own, nothing that you ever have done, nothing that you can do to induce God to spare you, one more moment.
May you ponder these words during our musical interlude.
On a more positive note, my second reading is called Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel? And these are the words to a traditional African American spiritual, which I will not sing. I told Heather earlier, no one wants that. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Then why not every man? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Then why not every man? He delivered Daniel from the lion's den, Jonah from the belly of the whale, and the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace. Then why not every man? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Then why not every man? I set my foot on the gospel ship, and the ship began to sail. It landed me over on Cana's shore, and I'll never come back no more. Deliver Daniel, then why not every man? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? So I've titled this talk, Then Why Not Every Man? In the late 90s, 1990 seems like a long time ago, I was thinking about a class on religion in America. And given my background in African-based religions, I wanted to include information about how Africans and African Americans had influenced the American religious landscape. That turned out to be more of a challenge than I first anticipated. We're all familiar with African American influences on American music, and scholars readily acknowledge that Caribbean and South American religions like Santeria and Candomblé and Shango are primarily based on West African precedents. But in North America, it is generally thought that Africans who came here lost all of their culture, including their religious cultures. Consequently, the story of African American religion in the United States generally starts with the Second Great Awakening, when hundreds of thousands of African heritage people were converted to Christianity and the foundations for contemporary Black church were laid. Of course, it defies common sense to think that the Africans who were brought to the Caribbean and South America retained major portions of their culture, including their religious ideas and practices, and those who arrived in North America forgot everything. So I started reading deeper into the literature and discovered many interesting things that I share in my book, which I happen to have a copy of if anybody wants. It's called Then We'll Sing a New Song, African Influences on American Religious Landscape. These things I found include archaeological digs that have found evidence of African religiosity from the colonial period to the post-Civil War in Texas. But most astonishingly, I came to believe that American evangelical Protestantism is the African-based religion of North America. Let me back up a minute and talk a little about the religion that the European colonists brought with them to this continent. Specifically, I want to focus on ideas about God. The history of European thinking about God is really interesting in itself, and those ideas changed and evolved over time. By the time the English colonists were beginning to settle the eastern coast of North America, the most prevalent idea was based on the thinking of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and his successors. Calvinism, as it developed in the 1600s, focused on the absolute power of God and the total depravity of humanity. According to this thinking, God has determined from all eternity who will and will not be saved by the sacrifice of Jesus, and there is nothing any individual can do to change his or her predestined fate. Good works, for example, could not save someone who was already condemned. We can see these ideas in the writings of the Puritans and the Pilgrims who settled in New England. It was expected that one would have a conversion experience during adolescence. One would describe that experience to the leaders of the local church, those saints who had already themselves had similar experiences. And if they validated your experience, you would be accepted as a member of the church and welcome into the company of saints. However, even that acceptance was always provisional. You might have fooled them into thinking you were among the saved. The local saints might have been mistaken. Up until the time of your death, you had to live with the uncertainty of the final disposition of your soul. As Gary Wills says, Puritanism required a believer to find certainty in uncertainty, required him or her to rely for salvation on the unmerited, predestined, saving grace while living a lifetime doing unrewarded good works, required him to search for his soul in the Holy Spirit, but denied him any direct revelation, required him to be pure, but told him he could not be. Colonists in the middle and southern colonies followed a softer type of Calvinism that both suggested that more people were saved and demanded that in addition to being chosen by God, one had to also choose to accept his invitation to salvation. This is the form of Calvinism that John Edwards' famous sermon, where he imagines us, that we just heard, as a noxious insect God is holding by a thin thread over a burning fire, just waiting to let go and condemn us to eternal suffering. This is a very different image from what most people have of God today. We are generally more familiar with the religion of those settlers in New England than those in the middle and southern colonies, as they came here specifically to be able to practice their religion, while the Southerners came to make their fortunes and were less religiously inclined. However, over time, both here and in Europe, the rather oppressive view of God and salvation, this that we just heard from Jonathan Edwards, fell out of favor. I can't imagine why. With the rise of the Enlightenment and a more secular view of the world, religious ideas and practices became less important in both continents. Europe became the highly secular place we see today, where few people attend religious services, have children baptized, bury their dead with religious funerals, or even believe in God. But something different happened here. Not only did Americans fight for and gain their political independence from Europe, they also did a religious about-face. While Europe was becoming more and more secular during the 18th and 19th centuries, America became more religious. According to the World's Values Survey conducted between 2005 and 2007, almost 40% of Americans reported that they attend religious services weekly, placing Americans 7th behind Jordan, Indonesia, Poland, Egypt, Brazil, and India, and placing us ahead of Iran, Italy, Canada, Britain, China, Germany, France, Russia, Japan, and Sweden. Almost half of the Americans surveyed, 47%, said that religion was very important in their lives, while fewer than 1 in 5 of the Swiss, 17%, and the Dutch, only 12%, and the Swedes, 9%, said the same thing. These are our religious ancestors, or our cousins. The question I asked myself then is what was different in America or among Americans that could account for this difference in religiosity. The biggest difference between early America and the Europe those settlers left behind was the great number of Africans who were brought to this continent between 1526 and the end of the slave trade in the early 1800s. So I decided to do two things in my book. First, I wanted to introduce my readers to several of the African cultures that made significant contributions to our culture. Africa's a really big place, but the majority of the enslaved came from areas along the west and west central coasts of Africa. I decided to focus on three cultures that made significant contributions to North America, for which we have really good records of their pre-colonial cultures: the Kingdom of Congo, the Kingdom of Dahomey, and the Oyo Empire. Each of these groups had a highly developed social and political system. They were not the primitive tribes that we often associate with pre-colonial Africa, what I often call the Tarzan view of Africa. These were civilizations as politically and culturally advanced as those of their European counterparts. In the book, I devote a chapter to each of these societies in order to give my readers a better insight, not only into these African cultures, but also an understanding of the similarities and differences between them. Some of you may have already heard me talk about Kingdom of Congo, which is in West Central Africa. The Portuguese, who were trying to find a route around Africa in order to establish trade with Asia, first landed in this area in 1483. By 1491, they had convinced the King of Congo to convert to Catholic Christianity, so that by the late 1600s, when the slave trade from Congo was at its height, the Congolese people had had over 200 years to develop their own form of Christianity. We often hear of Africans who were mass baptized before making their journey across the Atlantic, and thus were not Christians in any significant sense. The Congolese were different. Although there was always a shortage of priests, they managed to have their children baptized, they built chapels in their towns, and in the absence of clergy, they were led in religious rituals by local noblemen. Young men were sent to the capital to be educated, and many of the elite spoke several languages, including their own language of Kikongo, Portuguese, and Latin. Once educated, these same young men were sent back out into the countryside to teach the rudiments of Christianity to the villagers. The common people in Congo had the same level of Christian understanding as that of European commoners of the same period. They knew the basic catechism, they could recite prayers, and sing commonly known hymns. We know they didn't lose that knowledge when they were brought to the Americas. Priests in South and Central America record meeting Congolese slaves who could still recite the catechism and the prayers they learned as children. As with most Christian converts, the Congolese didn't completely repudiate their existing religious thought, but found ways to integrate their indigenous ideas about the afterlife, spiritual beings, and ethical actions with their Christianity. Both before and after they became a Christian nation, the Kingdom of Congo's cosmology included continuous interaction with their beloved dead. Where other African groups worshiped groups of deities, the highest beings in the indigenous Congolese cosmology were the dead, who maintained their interest in their families and had the power to help them. It was fairly easy to incorporate Catholic ideas about God, his human son, and saints into this worldview. Although the local clergy didn't always approve of these beliefs and the practices that went along with them, the Congolese considered themselves to be good Christians, and they were treated as such by the Vatican and its representatives. This is important because between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Africans brought to the United States came from the Christian kingdom of Congo and its neighboring kingdom of Christianized Angola. But among the British colonists, Catholic Christianity was considered almost as heathen as a tradition as any indigenous African tradition. In addition, there was little incentive among the master class to consider the religious traditions of the enslaved or to engage in proselytizing efforts. In fact, at the beginning of slavery in America, in the American colonies, it was thought that if slaves did convert to Christianity, they would have to be freed. As the Bible says, Christians cannot hold one another in slavery. Even after the British church officials put that fear to rest, said, oh no, ignore that piece, there was still little incentive to convert the enslaved. And comparing the rich sensory experience of African religious practice, it's hard to imagine that an early Anglican church service held much appeal for the African heritage people. Things began to change after 1740, when missionaries from the newer traditions of Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, and other groups began invading the southern colonies and attempting to convert the enslaved. The master class was encouraged to think that converted slaves would be more docile and tractable, while the more enthusiastic worship forms encouraged by these traditions seemed to hold greater appeal among the enslaved. It was during the Second Great Awakening, which began around 1790, that the enslaved began to convert in great numbers. It was during this period that American religion changed, including Americans' view of God, their relationship to Him, and their ideas about the afterlife. One of the most interesting changes during this period is Americans' view of God and the relationship to Him. The Calvinistic viewpoint emphasized God's utter transcendence and the wide gulf between Him and humanity. He sees us as a noxious insect. According to this view, because of our utter depravity, there is nothing we as human beings could do to bridge this gulf. Only God can save us from fiery hell, from the fiery hell that we deserve. And He has chosen from all eternity who was to be saved and who condemned. It was understood that the suffering and death of Jesus had ransomed some portion of humanity from this desperate fate, but the knowledge of who had already been saved was God's alone, and either there was nothing we could do to save ourselves, or in the softer form of Calvinism, we could choose to accept God's fate for us, but we could not change it. As the Great Awakening progressed, and African heritage people began not only to be included in local congregations, but were also recruited as leaders and exhorters. The view of God softened further. God moved closer to humanity, and salvation was extended to the masses. I used two spirituals to exemplify these ideas. In the one I read earlier, the singer asked, why the God who saved Daniel from the lion's den, Jonah from the belly of the whale, and the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace, why wouldn't He save everybody from a torturous afterlife? God certainly could save everyone, or at least make salvation available to them. Then why, as a good and holy being, would He not? It's a question that appeals to us as Unitarian Universalists, but also had great appeal to the enslaved and other members of the lower classes who were generally excluded from life of the local Anglican churches. Why wouldn't God save everyone, including the most wretched slave? Why indeed? One of the greatest differences between the tent revivals of the Second Great Awakening and the local congregations was the fact that they were open to all people, not just the rich and successful who had obviously been blessed by God with good fortune. Everyone came to the revivals, including the poor and the middling classes and even the enslaved. The Cane Ridge Revival of 1801, the first of the large revivals, drew thousands of people to an open field in Kentucky. It was one of the landmark events of the Second Great Awakening and affected the development of the Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian movements in the United States. It held the first examples of the many religious exercises, such as speaking in tongues, that were later exhibited throughout the southern and middle states. The small cities that grew up during these revivals weren't completely egalitarian by any stretch. The enslaved often had their own areas, their own services, and their own preachers. But sometimes blacks and whites worshiped together, sang together, rolled on the floor together, spoke in tongues together, and were slain in the spirit together. And afterwards, for a short period before the run-up to the Civil War, many integrated congregations before the run-up to the Civil War made many integrated congregations impossible. Before that, blacks and whites continued to worship together in mixed race religious communities back home. It was during this time that blacks learned the rudiments of Protestant Christianity, and it is possible that blacks shared their own views of God and our relationship with him with their fellow worshipers. That view is highlighted in another spiritual, which again I will recite and not sing. When I get dar, Captain Satan was dar, says, young man, there's no use for prayer, for Jesus is dead and God gone away. And I made him out a liar and I went my way. Oh, Satan is a mighty busy old man and rolls rocks in my way. But Jesus is my bosom friend and rolls them out of the way. This is a very different idea of God and the devil than we find in Jonathan Edwards' sermon. Here, God has gone from being a tormentor who views humanity as a noxious bug to becoming the singer's best friend who can roll away the obstacles set in the path of salvation. In the first verse of this, Satan is dignified by the title captain, as though he is one of the many whites the singer must defer to. But actually, he's a liar and not worth one's attention. In the second verse, he has become demoted to a busy old man whose obstacles are easily overcome by my bosom friend, Jesus. God may remain somewhat distant, but in the spirituals, Jesus is constantly viewed as a friend, a role model, and the being one can go to in times of trouble for comfort and release. There is no question in this short piece of one's relationship to God, no uncertainty about one's salvation. As Unitarian Universalists, we might find the secular atheism of Europe more familiar. But for the majority of Americans who maintain some belief in God, the God they believe in is more like that of the spiritual than that of Jonathan Edwards. This is a tremendous change in theological thinking, and it separates Americans from our European cousins, as well as our European forebears. How did these two people with similar roots in philosophical thinking let's see, I missed a line here. How do these two people with similar roots in philosophical thinking, people who read the same books, practice the same religions, participate in the same movements, develop such different ideas? What could have caused such a difference in culture? I suggest that it is the influence of the huge number of Africans from many different cultures that influence American religious landscape in such a radical manner. They weren't just passive recipients of European culture and ideas, but active players in the development of American religious culture. Their ideas about God and our relationship to Him found fertile ground among the revivalists, the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians of this period. We don't recognize these ideas as alien because they form the foundation of American religious culture. But they had to come from somewhere. And I'm suggesting we look to West and West Central Africa for inspiration. In fact, what I'm suggesting is more radical. I'm suggesting that the contemporary American movement is based on African influenced religious traditions. Thank you.
Well, Mary Ann, you gave us a lot of new information and a lot to think about. Our closing hymn is Come and Go With Me. And it absolutely calls out for clapping and waving your arms. So let's everybody stand up and with your masks on as you're able in body or spirit, hum, dance, or clap. Close, I share these words by Susan Carlson. We leave, blessed by our connections to one another, to the spirit of life. Walk lightly, that you see the life that is below your feet. Spread your arms as if you had wings and could dance through the air. Feel the joy of the breath in your lungs and the fire in your heart. Live to love and be a blessing on this earth. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. So I'm going to ask, are there any visitors here for the first time or people we haven't seen for a while that would like to introduce themselves? So I take you, okay. Your hand went up. Okay, we can't hear you up here. Why don't you come to I'm going to embarrass you totally. Come up to the microphone and say hi to our folks out in the Zoom land also.
Hi, I'm John Thompson, and here with my partner Gail Gregory for our first visit here. She's been here many in the past. My first time. We're just kind of looking around. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome. So I now invite you all to take a moment to greet everybody, have that conversation we interrupted earlier in the day perhaps, and especially greet our first timers. Those of you at home via Zoom, Marianne will stay here if you all want to have a conversation with her, or if those that are here have questions for Marianne afterwards, she's agreed to stay up here. So you all on Zoom know how the breakout room works. Don't go to a breakout room if you'd like to talk to Marianne. Thank you very much.